in this case, in today's presentation, the importance of grading. So I welcome you all to this exciting presentation by Dr. Creighton, and we will learn a little bit more and share some ideas about, how to grade for equity. One thing I would ask you is that if you have questions during the presentation, perhaps you could refrain from filling the chat with them, and we can have a question and answer session towards the end of Chris's talk. So thank you again for joining us, and welcome everyone. Thank you.
Yep, I'd like to welcome everyone, including the two people in the room here. Great showing. So yeah, I'm talking about grading for growth, grading through an equity lens. And I've been thinking a lot about this for like a long time now. I do a lot of work looking at K-12 and higher ed stuff and alignments of things. So this is kind of like the grounding of everything that I see. Just gonna go. Yeah, I just turned it on. Okay. That's the abstract, so I'm gonna skip through that. So let's see here. So the rough overview is I'm gonna talk about perceptions of grading, because I think a lot of us have feelings on grading in general, along with going through the history of grading, because I think a lot of people just don't know the history of grading, and then diving into equity issues and strategies for change. There's a lot of different things out there, like alternative grading systems that we've heard of. I think there's a talk about last year on ungrading and stuff like that. So there's a lot of different strategies for change here. And then along with the core learning objectives for this too, for me is like, you should be able to like roughly summarize the history of grading in the United States. Like you should just like roughly know how the history of grading worked out. And also be able to critique some equity issues in grading practices. Like that's one fundamental thing is like you should look at your grading system and look at it and be like, oh, there's some issues going on here. You should be able to critique your grading practices, along with identifying and discussing strategies for changing those practices if needed. So let's get started with the perceptions of grading. I think we all have perceptions of grading going through everything. So to start off with, it's okay to disagree. I will probably say a lot of things. I have my opinions. I have done a ton of reading on this stuff. So it's okay to disagree with me if you will. It's a very personal topic mixed with your own beliefs and institutionalized norms. Like every institution I've been to has a different grading beliefs. Like you can think about like undergrad to grad school. Like grad school grading is like you get an A, B, or you're going to get kicked out of the program type of a deal. While in undergrad, you have a lot more stratification in those. And so it's fine if you disagree with anything presented in this workshop. Just like try to question why you're disagreeing with it. All right, just like try to be like, wait, I don't like that. And then just be like, why don't I like it? And just try to internalize that a little bit. And then all I ask is that you keep an open mind about everything. I'm just trying to move the chat in the corner. So just like literally question everything. Like nothing has been fixed.
May I?
Yep.
May I interrupt?
Yeah, go for it.
I'd like to question whether you need to have your mask on. It's masking our ability to hear you clearly. And if there's only one other person in the room and they're 10 feet away, might you unmask? I don't want to put you at risk, but at the same time, it's
there we go.
It's a little hard to hear you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, better. All right. Yeah, and usually the orientation in this room is not set up for acoustics, I think. I'm facing a well instead of a wall. All right. Next, I just want to make sure it's easy to get caught up on details. So to me, thinking about grading is sort of looking like the root system of a tree, right? It's sort of like the underpinnings of a class with everything like that. So like you got to keep in mind that there's a whole other thing going on here. So if I say something that's like, I don't like that particular thing, there's other things to look at involved. And plus you have to think about the consequences of that looking up. And even in that, it's easy to get lost looking at the tree when there's a whole forest amongst everything else as well. So don't try to get caught up. Like if I say like, this practice is bad, but you use it a ton, just be like, okay, I think I should reevaluate that, but let's go on from there. It's easy to get caught up on that nitpicking detail. And then lastly, I just want to point out we are all faculty. We have survived the system, so there's survivorship bias involved in this as well. So for instance, this is a meme that I see going around online and some of my math ed circles, wherein each dot of this plane in World War II corresponds to a bullet hole when the plane arrives back to its base, all right? So This was looked at by statisticians, I believe, and in World War II, being like, where should we protect the plane? And at the time, they're like, well, the plane's coming back with all these bullet holes. Maybe we should reinforce what the bullet holes are. But really, you should reinforce what the bullet holes are not, because that's where the planes get hit and they don't come back. Like, think about it. If you get hit in an engine, you lose an engine, you're going down. If you get hit in the middle of the wing and your wing flies off, you're going down. So you have to realize that because we are here, we survived, but you have to look at where the students are dropping off. Like, this is like that leaky pipeline type of a deal as well. And so in looking at this with grades too, if you're thinking about, well, this has worked for me this long, just think about this. It's worked for you this long because the survivors are doing well, but you're still losing people along the way. All right, so just think about this in terms of survivor's bias as well. If it's worked this long, there's a reason it's worked this long for you. Which was the camera? Is that the camera or is this the camera?
Yeah, it's on that stick.
That one? Okay. It's like giving me a weird angle. There we go. Yeah, there we go. All right. So the first activity, I was going to start off with an activity. I like to do activities. So for 2 minutes, write your assumptions. If you know that a student is coming into your class with a C in the prior class, what assumptions do you make about that student? So for 2 minutes, so we'll go to 40 after, just write what your assumptions are.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm used to this chaos. Chaos. It was hilarious. All right, it's been about 2 minutes. So at this point, I would like to go just have a couple of people go around and share one of yours. So we'll start with the one person in the room.
Number one, I rarely know. I don't look at that kind of thing. But there have been times when I have looked after the fact just to see, because something was going wrong in the class and in the grading. But I guess just inside, if this happened, they might have a job. They might have other responsibilities. They might have other interests. They might have other priorities or background. They might have had a different teacher last semester that grades harder. But they might be just a very interested student who's just interested in learning and not grades.
Yeah. So if everyone can hear, whoops, I think I just popped that off. Anyway. So if you didn't hear Bruce over here, usually you don't know. He's pointing out he only looks if there's an issue going on, and there's just so many other complaining factors. Job, they might just want to learn the materials. There's a lot of other factors going on in this as well, to roughly summarize for people going on. Anyone else? What do you assume?
I'd like to jump in.
Yeah.
I actually don't really know how to say anything about a student's grade in a prior class, but I guess that's because of my research background. If I don't have the data, I can't say anything. Based on me just being in a chemistry class, a C in a prior class means that they probably missed something, most likely missing homework or did not do well on one exam. But beyond that, I don't have any data to say one way or another, because a C could be a 79 or a 70.5. These are not the same kind of student.
Mhm.
So that's why I really can't say and shouldn't say anything.
Right,
Not enough data.
exactly. Anyone else?
Yeah, I would say when I first saw your prompt there, that when I look at a C, I mean, I was always a good student, but I look at a C and I'm like, so that student got average. To me, it wouldn't be an immediate cause for alarm. It would just tell me, kind of like Jonathan said, well, maybe they did well in some of the assignments, but they didn't do so well in other ones. Thus, they got an average, right? So without digging, it's hard to say, it's hard to come to any assumption about it, but I would just look at that and go, okay, they did average.
Yep. Anyone else with anything, other inputs?
So I might just jump in and say, if the student was a previous student of mine and they got a C in like Italian 101, then perhaps I would think, okay, Italian 102 is more challenging. We're going to have 4 or 5 more new verb tenses. This student may need additional help. So I guess if you know the student and you've had the student previously, then you can maybe take steps to help him or her.
Mhm. Yeah, because like that's the point that I'm trying to make here is like the grades at the end of the class are supposed to tell a story, right? They're supposed to be an indication of something about the student, but does it? Like to me, it's like kind of a wash. Like when I was in grad school at Purdue, we actually had one of our faculty members do a flow through conversion rate of grades. Like if you got a grade in Calc 1, they looked at your potential grade in Calc 2. Then they had the student body and the statistics to do it. And they noticed that they corresponded to a grade drop. So that actually would tell us something what a C means. A C means that your grade would likely be a D in the next course. But then again, to me, I'm like, isn't that an issue? Because what we're saying with the C is that you should be able to go on to the next course and do well. So like the C, like these things should be like, mean something. But right now, I think the summary is we just look at it and go like, they made it into the class type of a deal. I think is a rough summary of what I would say. So going on to a little bit of the history of grading, I think most people don't know this part, and it's actually pretty new. So going back to the pre-industrial era in the United States, and again, this is United States focused. I will talk a little bit about international stuff, but pre-industrial era, there was one-room schoolhouses. That was the primary focus. We had students of all ages in the same room being taught by the same teacher. And in those situations, there weren't any grades. It was kind of like the teacher would then go home to the parents and be like, this is how your student's doing. This is the areas where we need to work. And even in those classes, you had students of all ages helping each other in sort of a community where the older students could help the younger students. I was talking to Chris Pacici about this. He's kind of doing this in one of his merged classes this semester. And so getting the older students to help the younger students form this community and this bond where the teacher is also likely a member of like the church community and everything like that in these cases here. So the education was all informally assessed via the teacher's professional judgment. And most times the teachers here didn't even have high school educations at the time. I know that up until 1870, there were only 500 high schools in the United States. Like most people here did not go to high school. But also in this age was when the Ivy Leagues were starting to play around with ranking students and stuff like that. So it all started with doing competitions in these Ivy Leagues. And then they would have a back end not shown to students ranking of the students on these competitions. And that's where, let's see here. A lot of the schools like started to do like the magna cum laude and stuff like that. Yale had the optimi, second optimi, inferiors, and pejores, going back to a lot of Latin roots there. And all of these grading systems were internalized and were not shown to the students. And so the records were all kept privately by the instructors or by the institutions. And often they would only use these to determine like valedictorians at the end of their schooling. They had no formal assessments. And so I just want to point out and call out too, this is actually at the Henry Ford Museum. In like 4th grade, I sat in like this seat back in like the 2nd row. Like I've been in that room. Yeah. That's actually at the Henry Ford Museum outside Detroit. But like going back to like the pre-industrial era, this is really what it was about. It was all informally done. And then we go to the industrial era. Yeah, there's a Montessori school style going on like that. And I've actually interacted with quite a few students with that, where they actually, Montessori students going into higher ed, struggle with the conversion of a lot of different things in that. I've noticed. I was teaching one Montessori student once, and she was having issues with getting the understanding, but also getting the matching grade for her understanding. There's issues going on with those types of conversions too. Anyway, the industrial era, this all stems from the rise of manufacturing. So I said in 1870, there were only 500 high schools in the country. And then by 1910, there were 10,000 high schools in the country. So the rise of manufacturing led to the rise of compulsory education, but led to the rise of an increase in schooling, and schooling for the sake of getting people into these factories. That was the underlying goal. The schooling was to make sure that the students knew the education that they needed to succeed in the factory setting, and needed to train people to work in a factory setting. Just think about everything in like K-12, where you're like, the bell goes off, everyone stands up and leaves. In the younger grades, you had all the students line up in the hallway, getting ready to go into the next room. Like, that's very much due to the rise in manufacturing. And the letter grades would then try to correspond to saying, hey, are you ready to go into a manufacturing setting? So the rise of manufacturing led to a rise of compulsory education, which also meant we needed to assess these and be able to tell people in the future what was going on with these students. And so that led to the use of letter grades and percentage grades. I think, what university did it? Harvard was using a 100-point scale in 1837. So the 100-point scale and the letter grades sort of merged at the same time. The letter grades themselves, I think, started at, what university? Holyoke, I think, Mount Holyoke, I think, and College of William and Mary were experimenting with a lot of these in the beginning. And they were a way to try to assess the students in some sort of way. Additionally, around this time too was the rise, in the early 1900s, the rise of intelligence testing, which, if you know the history of intelligence testing, there's issues there. But with the rise of intelligence testing in World War I for troops, a lot of people were like, well, we're testing for intelligence, and intelligence, we believe, is on a normal distribution. And here in schools, we're assessing students' intelligence in theory on a lot of this stuff. So our grades should also align to a normal distribution. And so going back to the, who founded intelligence testing, or I think the person who founded the IQ test was a person who also coined the term eugenics. So the rise of using a normal distribution and grading on a normal distribution, and even our internalized feelings of we can't have too many A's in our class, probably go back to the fact that we probably internally believe in our normal distribution, goes back to questioning, do our students align with the normal distribution at all? And then also around this time, we had John Dewey, who was trying to get, who viewed education and supported all of these reforms, in that he wanted to support the growth of democracy in this country over military and economic growth. And he said we should educate our students to be well, to understand and do well and understand the issues in the country, so that they can be good citizens and essentially good voters and promote democracy in this country. Unfortunately, he lost, and the economic and military forces of why we need compulsory education won. Also around this time came into behavioralism. So if you go back to some of the learning theories, behavioralism was big at this point. If you don't know, this is like Pavlov's dogs type of thing. We're going back to the, you whistle and they start to salivate, because prior to that, every time you whistled, you give them a treat. And so eventually, if you whistle, they'll just start expecting a treat. And so a lot of our educational systems are set up in behavioralist way, where we're trying to control for their behavior via using grades as a reward or punishment system as well. So that's the rise of the grades in the industrial era. And then in the modern era, actually, one stat that I found the most interesting was, it wasn't until 1971 when 60% of K-12 school, or 67% of K-12 schools, use letter grades. So letter grades in conferring information in K-12 settings is actually like 1971, like I wasn't alive, but I think some of us were, just no shade, but they're new. And so like I was talking to my parents, and in school, they were mostly given letter grades instead of percentage grades. And additionally, with the use of norm-based grading, and there are some issues with using the 0 to 100 scale, which I'll talk about here soon, using and assigning grades on a normal distribution became like the norm. And in this case here, back in the original days where they would break down the grade distribution of like top 25%, middle 50%, and bottom 25%, in that where the average was a 50%. And you see this in other countries today still. Around the modern era is when the shift happened to be the average of 75, bucketing everything into 10 categories, and then having the F's just encompass like a giant chunk of the grade. And in the modern era, we have the Department of Education pushing a lot of these education initiatives. The ones that I think of are going back to a lot of the work of Danny Bernard Martin. He's a math ed researcher, and he calls out that a lot of the current math initiatives, thinking about the 1960s new math, going into math for all in the 80s, and then the Common Core update in the, like 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, yeah. A lot of these developments were rooted in either military or economic growth and not at all in terms of students. And the argument for all these is that we have to be competitive on a national scale. Our students are not competitive on the international scale. We need to boost our students' knowledge to make them competitive on the international scale and to get students into either military, like national security, or we'll get them into positions where they can help boost our economy. So a lot of the assessments and grading coming from that, like standardized testing and everything like that, goes back to national policy. So that's roughly where we are on this. And a lot of the things that we are seeing right now in K-12 stem from a lot of the federal policies coming from the DOE. All right, so that's like the Cliff Notes version of that. So getting into the equity issues of grading practices. So activity 2, so I'll give you guys about 4 minutes, let's say, on this to answer these 3 questions. So the first one is briefly summarize. You can either write this down or like internally briefly summarize using the A through F letter grade. So based upon your prior knowledge or whatever I talked about here. Then go to answer the question, how does the use of homework grades affect the accuracy of grades? And then third, discuss the use of self and peer evaluations in terms of feedback instead of grading. So I'll give you guys like 4, maybe 5 minutes to answer these questions. I think I'm coming from Montessori schools. It's a change. The one that I was having issues with that elementary ed content tool, and she's like, what? This is not how I defend that. And then teachers are coming forward, and she didn't do this. She didn't understand. Yeah. And so when you go to elementary ed, teacher is not in my she wasn't prepared. Like she didn't have that experience coming through as a student. And so she was like looking at people like students, and then they would like be like, yeah, that's how we do it. And she'd be like, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that'd be the thing. She was like, yeah, she was really on the shoes. if you finish early, feel free to put like a thumbs up or a done in the chat, just so if. I think that'd be good. This is like, if we just got rid of the computers in this room, this would be a great classroom. Mhm. Oh, boy. The next one. We'll probably get a shift in people here if they don't have to teach. Mhm. Oops. Oh, come back. Okay, so gave you an extra minute there. No one said they were done. So moving on. Now grade yourself on each of these questions using a 0 to 100 scale. Grade yourself. Use whatever you feel and just grade yourself. Give you guys like one more minute. Or if you're done, you can put like a thumbs up or something. All right. So next, I have some student responses, and I want you to grade those on the 0 to 100 scale. So the same questions, and this is a student responding to those really briefly. So take a second to read them. So I'll give you like guys 2 minutes to do this. And then, so for each of these, grade them on 0 to 100 based upon whatever you want. So you can give me a little thumbs up or something in the chat if you're all good. All right, I think most people are good on this. So the next part here, I just want to go back to the questions real fast. So again, the first one is briefly summarizing the history of the A through F grades. How does the grades affect the homework affect the accuracy of grades, and discussing the use of peer or self-peer evaluations in terms of feedback instead of grading. So the next one here is I'm going to click this link. I think it should me actually give myself access to that. Forgot this was in a different login. Oh, you're good. I'm fast at these things. There we go. All right. So in this case here, I'm going to record everyone's grades for Tina on this. So if people would just tell me what you scored for Tina here. Oops, this is for question one. Let's do that. So what did you give Tina on question one?
Oh, I'm supposed to do them separately. I see. So I flunked that in.
I mean, we can break that down too.
I got 85.
85. So we're going 85. Next person. This will show up in a
90.
second. Huh? Here, I'll just go around the room and call them out. Bridget.
85 also.
85. Karen, yes.
Right. Oh,
Dr. Scott.
90.
90. Karen K.
I had an 85 as well.
I would like to add that 85 was, actually it was a B, but
A B.
I knew I was supposed
All
to do it as a percentage, so I converted it.
Ah, he did a
I
B.
don't think there's a level of precision of 85%.
I know, right? All right, Chris P.
90.
90. Kevin Duncan. You there? All right, moving on. Rick.
80.
80. Jonathan.
Oh, I put on text, but I gave them an 84.
84. All right. Letitia.
Kind of did what Bruce did. I did a B first, and then I converted it to a 82%.
All right, B. Priscilla. Around 85%. 85. And then Yvonne.
90.
90. Denise.
Like
80. All right. There we go. Those are the ones for it. And you notice that there's a lot of different strategies going on here. Oh,
No, that's you.
I'm not on this. Oh, you're good. Yeah, so we see there's a lot of variation here on this. And like, for the people who assigned like an 84 and 82, that seems like a very fine measure there. Can you explain those? Like a lot of people went with 80, 85, or 90.
It was a low B. I
A
was
low B.
not the lowest, but not mid, but in between mid and low.
Gotcha. Okay. And then let's do question 2 real fast. Let me click this on here.
So Chris, I did make a comment in the chat. I think the answers to question 2 will probably change depending on if the faculty fellows read Feldman's book or not, because yeah, okay.
That's fine. But all right, who wants to volunteer some grades for this one? 81.55, you said, Chris?
I guess I was joking about the first grade.
Ah. All right. Let's go around the room again. So Bridget,
I'll admit I was kind of giving a global grade for all three. So I think
Okay.
for this one, I'm going to say an 82 for the question.
82. Karen Y.
If I remember correctly, this is the homework one, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to give him a 95.
We've got some bigger variation there already. Karen K.
I had a 90.
Wow. That's
Chris.
So I had about a 75, but then if I think about Feldman, I'd give him a 93. So I don't know if I averaged the two or what.
All right. I was put a dash there. All right. Rick.
50.
50.
Wow. Wow.
Jonathan.
I gave them an 89.
89.
Yeah, 89.
Cool. Letitia.
I did C 76.
All right. Priscilla.
Well, I thought those questions were more about their personal opinions, so I gave them 100% because I don't feel like they should match what I think. So
Okay.
that's why.
Yeah. Yvonne.
85.
85. Do you want to chip in one? Throw 95. All right. That a lot more variation there,
Oh my gosh.
right? Like this is interesting here. Then for the last one, oh, go back to Tina's. Right, I can do that real fast. So the last one here was about using self and peer evaluation. So the last one is to help the students learn self-regulation. So I'll give you a second. How does self and peer evaluation help with students, help with feedback instead of grading? That good, Bridget? Cool. All right. Whoop, going too far there. All right. So for question 3, who wants to volunteer some? Or do you want me to go around the room again? C.
10.
What'd you say, Rick?
10.
10. All right. Bridget.
Brutal.
I know, right?
72.
72.
Wow.
Mamma mia.
Isn't that nice?
I know, right?
80, 80
80
for compositions.
for composition. All right.
I
Bridget.
did
They
6.
used a noun and a verb in that
They
sentence.
did.
Oh,
Huh? And they were congruent.
there you go.
Capitalize the first letter. There's a period. What the heck?
25. All right. Letitia.
60%.
Oh, geez. Karen Y. Did I get you?
You got
Yeah,
72.
I gave my 72.
72.
Very
okay.
generous
No,
72.
I couldn't tell who was speaking there. Chris, did I get you?
I think so.
All right, got Rick. Karen K.
Yeah, I had a 70 as well.
70. Jonathan.
Oh, I don't feel bad for this anymore. 25.
25.
Thank you, Jonathan.
God, you STEM people.
We stick up for each other in chem, Rick.
All right, Priscilla.
Well, for personal opinion, I gave all the
We stick
points.
for each other.
100.
100%, yeah.
All right. And then Yvonne.
65.
65. All right, we had some variation there. And what did we notice when we were all doing this? Did anyone notice something? It's all over the place. Why?
There's no basis.
There's no basis, right? I mean, that was a question assessing a learning outcome that I had at the beginning, though, right?
Yeah, but you haven't defined what you wanted them to learn.
Yeah, I did.
No, you didn't.
Yeah, I did.
I didn't see a syllabus. You made no,
Right there. You'll be
you've
able
given
to
no,
identify
you've given no expectations. Nope.
Nope. But that was a learning outcome though. You'll be able to identify and discuss strategies for changing grading practices. And that is a strategy for changing grading practices.
Really?
And that is a correct answer.
The
to
history of grading has anything to do with that?
I don't know. I was assessing the practices for the entire workshop.
Mm.
Indeed.
I bet your math class doesn't look like that.
Alex does. Alex does an initial course assessment where they give them a learning outcomes for the entire course and students do it. So I know Chem 111 does it. So,
and you grade it, but it's not graded. It just gives an assessment of where they are.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not graded.
So?
Well, we're applying grades to these.
Right. You get it. You get it. So the point here is that, like, I think there was no defined rubric at all, right? I think that's what you're getting at, Rick. I did not give you a rubric. So, like, for instance, even in a math context, like for instance, or chemistry or whatever, we give them a problem, right? And there's so much variability in grading of these things. Like, so for instance, some of us were being like, they answered the question with their opinion. Who am I to comment on that? And that was correct. Well, some of you looked at composition. Some of you looked at whether this was a part of the everything or not. So, like, Rick, why did you give them a 10 on that?
So I would expect as a college student, you might reference something, you might look something up, you might do a little bit more work than put it was, that's what I was grading at, as a college professor, I would expect a bit more than that. But you haven't defined anything. So
I just gave you a question and an answer aligned to a learning outcome. I did not give you anything else.
I can always adjust things if there's other students.
Well, and is this an essay test, a short response test? I didn't, right?
Right. It's a workshop test.
Right?
Yeah, right. So, like, if this was like a fill in the blank, but if this is like you had like a take-home test and got this answer, I think we would probably give a lot lower grade whether this was an in-person class when they're quickly jotting something down. Again, the standards though for
why would you change?
Time.
Okay,
if it's a take-home test, you could probably expect a bit more thought and like citations and things. Well, in-person class, they may not remember the exact citation, but they can do it. There's no rubric, so you're grading an implicit framework here too. And I won't even tell you with a rubric, you're still going to see fluctuations. They won't be as big, but the research does show that there's still fluctuations in grading, even with rubrics, because then it comes down to professional judgment. We all have different judgments of professional, like what meets our standards versus everything. So that was sort of the point there. Well, this thing has fluctuated all over the place because we all had different measures of what we're looking at here. So going into again, Karen points out it's our judgment. Yeah, it is completely our professional judgment here. I'll talk about this in a second, but I view grading as subjective, not objective. It is our professional opinion that we are placing upon these, and expecting our students to rise to. So I'll talk about that here in a little bit. So in this case here, another thing to consider with percentage grades, because another thing here is like you look at these percentage grades and they're all over the place. And if we were to categorize them using like the usual grading system, we would have grades from F to an A, right? All over the place. And so percentages themselves are sort of an issue, all right? Another thing to consider is using percentage-based grades, even a percentage-based course base, is that there's a maximum grade you can obtain every time you assign something. So for instance, looking at this graph over here on the right side, if a student got a 40% on exam 1, the chart below is not the graph. This is 2 different examples. So if you look at this 40% on exam 1, and each exam is weighted equally. So each exam is 25% of their grade. That 40% on exam 1 reduces their max grade to an 85% in the course. No matter what your understanding of the course content later, Using a percentage breakdown, your max grade is now at 85%. No matter what you learn later, it's going to be an 85%, assuming 100% on everything. Now, if you look at the gray one, that's the actual one. So if they improved, they got 65% on the exam too. That boosts their running grade up to a 52%, 52.5%, which is like, okay, you're improving. Like, I'm happy to see that. I'd love to see a student improve by that much on a math exam. But that 65 reduces their max grade to a 76.25%. No matter what they do later, they cannot get above a C in the course. Because if you look at exams 2 and 3, they did an 85 and then a 90 on those exams, right? I see so few students get a 90 on like a final exam that if I see that, I want to reward it. Like, that student knows what they're doing. Like, they likely turned whatever was happening around and learned the content and did well on exam 3 in the final comprehensive exam. But because the max cap grade, it keeps reducing each time, even that 85% hurt them because they would not be able to get above a 72.5. It dropped it, even though they improved by like 20% on that exam, meaning that 90% put them at a 70 at the end of the course. So that's one issue with like having a running grade using the grade percentages, is that no matter how much they improve, there's a cap grade there going throughout the entire course. Like, you can have a student like tank the first exam, tank the second exam, ace the third, ace the final, and still not get the grade that accurately represents what they know, right? And again, we go into a little bit again with inter-rater reliability. So there's many, many studies coming from like 1913 was the first one I saw for inter-rater reliability issues. And that's actually why a lot of schools in the industrial area moved away from using the 0 to 100 scale to the letter grades, because the inter-rater reliability on the 100 scale is massive. Even with rubrics, there's a massive issue with that, because again, even with the rubric, someone might say like, well, this person more fits in this category and this person more fits in that category. But with the 0 to 100 categories, there's massive variations that could still occur. So that's why people moved to the A, B, C, D, F scale, was to reduce that inter-rater reliability by quite a bit. And lastly, in this slide, is that students with the same grade can have still have a large variation in content knowledge. So if you look at the bottom down here, these are 2 students. And I'll say I built these scores based upon experience with students that I've seen. So these are not actual students' grades, but I've seen students with similar grades in this situation. So for instance, student 1 just got 60% on every single exam, but did an 83% on their homework and a 90% on other things where it could account for like quizzes or like pre-class assessments or writing things or whatever. On other things, they got 90. And the grade breakdown for this is exams are 60%, homework's 30%, and whatever is in the other categories is 10%. And so student 1 here, their average grade using those things will be a 69.9. Pretty good. Like, I would probably consider bumping them up to a C, right? But then student 2 here did a 70, 80, 85, then 95 on the final. They improved and they were already in the passing rate. But because they got a 45% on their homework and a 50% on the other category, likely due to like maybe they were having life issues and they just couldn't get the homework and they were just like making sure they understood it by the exam, or they were honestly not understanding the homework as they were going along. But then by the time the exams hit, they understood it. Or like there's so many other things, or like they already knew the information, so they didn't need to do the homework. Using those averages, that student would get a 68%, a lower grade. So looking at these 2 things, if we look at the exams only, student 1 got a 60% and student 2 got an 82.5% in it. So looking at this, which grade would more accurately reflect what the student knows? The overall weighted grade or the exams only grade?
Wow.
Because my issue was, and this goes off to like a true story that happened here, is I had a student that looked very closely to student 2 right here. And the grades are like slightly off from this, but I did not give them the bump up because they would have skipped someone that looked like student 1, and I didn't want to bump them up. Because I was like looking at their exam grades, I'm like, there's no reason why if I passed you that I would expect you to do well in the next course. Student 2 would. So, but if I were to bump student 2, that wouldn't be fair to student 1, right? Like, at all, because if I bump student 2, I've ranked them already.
I don't agree with you, Chris,
Why?
because of equity and not equality.
Explain.
Mhm.
So I don't think you have to treat each student equally. What you do to one doesn't have to necessarily be what you do to another. It's your professional judgment as a professor to make that call.
Right. How do you deal with your own internal biases for these students, though?
What I see student 1 and student 2. I don't have an internal bias.
You sure about that?
Yeah, I don't know. You might because you had them,
Hmm.
but isn't that part of your job?
Yes and no, right? Like I would honestly want to bump student 2 up to a C. But the counter argument to that is like, if I did that using my professional judgment, what if student 1 finds out and they do a grade appeal saying my grade was higher than someone else who got bumped up? Yeah, Priscilla?
So what if a student too, like they did bad in their homeworks and then they went to your office hours, you explained the homework, they understand it, and that's why they have higher exams, but not higher homeworks. And
So-
what would you do in that situation?
So
Go ahead, and then I'll come.
yeah, to me, the issue is I need to worry about the internal biases, because then that student may have the knowledge that doing that and coming to my office hours would potentially allow them to get an increasing grade, while first generation students may not have that knowledge that they should be coming to my office hours to be able to get into my mind for something like, oh yeah, you're really doing this and trying, and then I'll give them the grade boost.
So why are we discussing equity if you're just going to apply equality?
That's the point here. This is a current grading system, right?
Well,
Like,
it's
this is
your
what-
current grading system.
Right, but
I got the impression that Chris was showing us the internal contradictions of such a great
Yeah.
system, that he's displaying. I mean, I find this is actually a straw man. I've never used this kind of a rigid system.
it's used in our intro classes. That's the kicker.
Yeah,
Right?
But I do find that there's been a regime over my 40 years more of teaching to require me to put more and more specific information and percentages in my syllabus under the theory that
Yeah.
the student at any point should be able to calculate their
Mhm.
grade. And
Especially-
I find that unlivable. And the
Especially
idea
with
that,
Blackboard,
my
right?
professional judgment isn't the most powerful thing, just defeats the whole idea of education.
Mhm.
If I'm highly educated, I should be educated in judging standards of subjects.
Right.
I'm not judging objects. But anyway, there's a whole philosophy.
There's a whole issue
I think
here.
you're trying
But-
to-
Yeah, I'm poking the philosophy because I'm telling you right now, this is like how our math 101 and intro courses are set up, right? Like,
Yeah.
right, this is how we teach here, and this is what we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis.
You-
And so whenever I
you-
look at a grade bump, I go like, I want to bump you, but then my internal conflict starts to kick in about whatever biases I may or may not have for students, and whether first generational students or other students that have other things going on know how to ping my opinion and ping me to think about boosting them, you know?
So,
like, this
I
might
mean,
not be
the
your
other-
grading system, but this does happen here.
I mean, the other argument is you've provided them with a rubric of what they need to do in the course to get a certain grade, right?
Right?
That's your syllabus. And student 2 really hasn't met what you told them they need to meet.
Did they need to though?
Does it matter? I mean, that's
Yes.
what a rubric is.
So
If
think
you're going
about
to use
this,
a rubric
though.
for anything, that's what a rubric is. You're
Uh-huh.
telling them what they need. Yeah. You're telling them what they need to meet to get a certain score, right?
Mhm.
That's what a rubric is.
Right,
And that's what a syllabus is. You
right.
told them that their homework was a certain percent of their grade.
Mhm.
So they know what they need to do to get that a good grade in their homework, right?
Yeah,
Right.
but Rick, do you really
And-
think student D is a D student? You believe in your heart of hearts that student D, who gets 80s and 95s on tests and finals, is a
No,
D?
no, no. I'm just playing devil's advocate to my other argument,
Okay, okay.
Right.
right? I'm on the other side that you can bump one without the other.
Okay.
I don't think that, I think that's totally fair and totally appropriate. Without
Yeah.
bumping 69.9, I think that's totally fair.
Yeah.
because
so
you
to
know the
me,
situation.
Yeah,
Otherwise,
I'm not
otherwise,
disagreeing with you there. That was
otherwise, there's no
entirely-
reason that we have faculty fellows right now.
Right.
We can just go home.
Right. So to me, that is entirely the point. It is up to your own professional judgment right there. All right. That needs to be a massive part in this. That's why I said grading is subjective. Anytime you try to put some objectivity on it, like this case here, where like a lot of people would view such a system like this as being more objective, right? Like we set the syllabus, we're doing this, this is the objective thing. I graded the problems. These are your scores. This is objectively it. And I'm saying that that's not actually going to be the case. That is just, I heard someone coin the term objectivity theater for this. You do need to put your professional judgment on it. That's why I put the exams only scores there. Only having the exams better reflects what the students know as well, right? Like that second student there should be like a more of a B student even. I would even question that 82.5 as being too low because they got an 85 and a 95 on the last two exams. Maybe they should better be an A student in the end, right? Yeah, Karen, that's exactly it. The issue is that it is objective, but you have your own internal biases. We all do, all right? And so that is something that you need to build into your system. This system doesn't have it because at some point you have to go with your gut here on it. And if someone appealed that gut, what would your reaction be, right? Like it's gonna be a discussion between you and your chair, your faculty, so you're probably gonna win, right? But you need to have something that's backable there. So that was essentially the point.
Don't you think you would have this conversation with a colleague before you did that though?
Yeah, of course, right?
So it's not your, so like, hey, let's discuss, you got a minute, can we discuss these two students?
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. So like there's a lot more factors going into it than just that, but it's still a subjective thing when you're discussing these things, right?
Well,
All the grades were
I
too.
find the either or subjective
Yeah.
objective to be,
It's a
bifurcation that's not necessary. I mean, a part of my professional judgment is to carefully collect and reflect upon data, right?
Right.
And that forms my gut. So, without doing that, I could go off on some dream.
Yeah. Right.
But I have to be anchored in that data.
Right. You have to have certain standards of your own set, right? And so it comes down to your own set standards and communicating those to the students in some way.
Yeah, and then I have to question myself when I
Exactly.
go off of this system and trying to, I have to say, be very careful and discuss with other colleagues.
Exactly.
On
Right.
the problem cases.
Exactly. Yeah. Like you should do nothing alone in any discussion, like, because in that case, that acts as another check to your own biases too, or someone might be like, are you sure you're thinking about this right? Like this student has been in your office like every day. Are you sure you're being fair to the other students because that student's always been in your office and you're seeing how hard they've worked? Is that really a fair measure for their knowledge bumping them up, right? And that's where the colleagues conversation comes in too, right? Like, is that really a fair thing to do as well?
Well, I wanted to say, I think this exercise has really helped me look at things because it helps me to process, like, in which cases am I actually looking at mastery of material and knowledge for the course versus am I looking at things like discipline? Did they make this class a priority? Responsibility? Did they get their work in on time? The time they have to, I mean, some people, they can do well on exams if they have a lot of time, but there's not a need for them to register with the Disability Resources Center, right? It's just that, it takes them longer to read and process, but they don't have what would be considered a learning disability. And do they have time to do their homework because they're working or doing other things? And so I'm thinking about just some of my own classes that are very point-based and percentage-based and intro classes. And some of, I think, what the ways that I'm grading are on some of these other categories like discipline and responsibility and time, as opposed to just mastery of material. And so that I think really gives me something to think about. But also, having different kinds of assessments and making them worth a certain percentage, I think it helps in terms of equity, because you have people who do well on exams and in the performance aspect of something, and then some people who do well on the other like homework aspects that take time to think and process because that's how they learn. And so I feel like it becomes like a difficult task to still do that. And I feel like the whole, well, I got to look at this student is that's a slippery slope, because I think it does become very biased. Whereas I do kind of gravitate toward the points and percentages. Although when I saw the first little graph up there, I was like, now I know I got a C in chemistry as an undergrad because I did so well in my last couple of exams and I really learned and I got all A's in lab, but I didn't recover from those first couple of things. And I was just like, oh, thanks for lab. I got, all A's in lab, which was hands-on. And, and it was really illuminating just to see this, because I had never, even as an instructor, I had never seen the huge impact of that kind of learning. So this was really helpful for me because I have to really rethink some of my objectives and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in that, just think about how much a 0 would hit. Massive, right? If I gave you a 0 on one of the exams, your max grade is 75. You're failed. You failed. That assumes 100% on everything else. So there's so much to break down with our current system, I'd say. And I know everyone uses different things in different courses, but this is the most common one I see in the basic courses, the intro courses I see.
So in that example, are they only getting a grade based on their exam?
This one here, no, they would get the grade based upon the weights of everything, but the comparison should be the exams only, because what would be a more representation of their knowledge? Learning on their homework, the other things that it could be like showing up or like doing participation, things like that. Or is it more representative using the exams only?
No, I was wondering on your 75%, if you got a 0 on 1, that's not quite right.
Right. So like, for instance, like if you got like so usually the zeros start to impact usually like on the homework grade, like maybe on this homework, the student had like firm deadlines and the instructor wasn't extending them. And so they were just getting zeros, although they were still doing them, for instance. Like that 45%, I would seriously question what is going on with either the student or the instructor policies type of a deal. Same thing with that 50% on other. Like I'd be like, something's happening here. That's not representative of the student. So, because that goes into the.
I think also.
Yep.
I think also we need to consider the test taking anxiety, right? I mean, there's a big difference between working at home on developing your understanding of something and then a one-time assessment that's timed that may represent what you know, but may not represent what you know, because you're too anxious about it, especially if it's very heavily weighted. And so I know test taking anxiety can really offset that performance score for some.
Yeah. So there's I feel so many factors on this, because I would even say that maybe those exam scores that are like the early ones aren't even representative of their knowledge at all. Like looking at that 95% on the final exam, I'd be like, maybe I should just like kill those first exams, because maybe that 95%, they learned it by the end of the course, right? That's the big thing here. And so that's where I'm breaking down the idea here between formative and summative assessments, right? So a lot of us, like exams are a summative assessment. You're like, we are going to assess you on the learning outcomes of this course, right? And so it's a summative thing. The students are then going to go into it and demonstrate what they know. While there are formative assessments, things like quizzes, things like homework, things like activities and things like that, those are formative. I don't want the students to try to get 100% on them, because they need to spend time understanding the content. If a student is getting 100% on all the formative assessments, I then question it, because I'm like, are you spending the time to do it, So like, for instance, the idea of homework is actually a very Americanized thing. In most countries, they don't have homework, right? Homework here is structured in a way to be a formative thing, but the second you start grading it, that tells them, the students, that they need to try to maximize their grade. And so they should be getting 100% on it, right? Because if they don't, that max cap grade is going to start dropping. And so instead of trying to understand the homework and use it as practice for the exams and things like that, the students are then going to try to get 100% on it by cheating, by doing other things, just getting it done by the deadline, because they don't want their grade to drop. And therefore, they see an issue with later on exam performance. So like maybe the student one in the previous case was trying to maximize their grade because they knew that they didn't fully understand the content. So like in math, they could be going online and trying to get the answers first, and just like on the online homework system, for instance, and just trying to maximize their grade. Well, number two, we might have been viewing it more formatively, being like, hey, I'm trying to understand this. I don't understand this. I need more time to understand this, but I'm not getting that time to understand. But they're spending the time to practice the material still and doing well on the exams. So that is a huge thing with formative and summative assessments, and the inclusion of formative things on grades, because grades to me should reflect student knowledge. Like at the end of the course, like a C student, I don't think anyone here knew what to say about that, but really that's an issue because those letter grades initially are for communication about students at the end of the course, right? Like that is a huge issue. And so one thing that you should think about in all your courses is, what does it mean to get an A or get a B, get a C, so that when another instructor comes to you, you can be like, well, this student mastered these contexts this well and these other outcomes not so well. And so you can actually say what that would mean, rather right now, like both those students, I would be like, it's really too hard to say. Like even if it's a bump or not bump, if one got a C and the other one got a D, even that would be like really hard to like convey information at the end of the course. The end of the course information should convey something about the student. And this also gets into the idea of grading versus feedback. And this is actually like, I've been reading this one paper about it. So, I lost it here on this paper. But essentially, students don't look at any grades as feedback. It is not viewed positively in light of students. So for instance, if you write a grade on an exam or homework or anything like that, grade only, that's one case. The second case, if you write a grade and feedback, and the third case, if you write only feedback on it. The student getting only feedback performs better on later problem-solving tasks than the students that getting grade and feedback and getting grade only.
That's interesting.
Yeah, the students getting feedback only, 0 grades.
Wow.
And in fact, if you grade something that are given to you, it's like, so for instance, one example is if you have students write an essay and you grade the essay and write a ton of feedback on it. One study showed that pre-medical students usually do not come to collect their feedback from their instructor. Like I think many of us are aware, like if we're like, come collect your work, and they just don't come. Even the best students will never come and collect their feedback because they're not going to look at the feedback. The second that grade hits and you collect something, they are not going to take any feedback from it. So grading and feedback are two entirely different things, which is why when I hear like you need to provide grades to students throughout the course as feedback, I'm like, that's not the case. You need to be providing feedback through the course along with feedback about if you're going to pass or not at the end. So like the starfish things I'm kind of fine with because I'm like, okay, this is making sure you're on track and aware of your current grade, because I'm going to tell you right now, many of the students pre-101 can't actually compute their own grades. All right, that's a big issue that I see. But if you want to give students feedback so that they can actually action and learn, the feedback has to be immediate. All right, it's like the student has to be with you or something like that. And this is where self and peer evaluation kick in. You want the students to develop a sense of self-regulation with their feedback so that they can know what they're doing. And then at the end of the course, grade on their performance, on their summative work. So feedback and grading are not the same thing. If you're like, I need to grade everything in minutia, the students will look at that and be like, okay, I got a 60%, and then move on. And no matter what comments you write down, all right? Feedback is it. No matter what descriptive feedback you work, if the descriptive feedback itself on anything you collect. So if you want students to actually get feedback on work, self-evaluations, peer evaluations, talking to students in the class, building in class times for these evaluations is much more important as feedback. If you collect something from them and give it back later, they're not going to take it as feedback, even if it's graded. And grading, again, as a motivator is not, don't think of grading as motivation as well. The issue is that grading is actually a demotivator for all students except for students with A's, in which the case is those students view grading as a motivator to continue to get A's, and they'll get very upset if they don't get that A. I think we've all experienced students like that before. Grades appear to play to students' fears of punishment or shame or their desire to outcompete peers as opposed to stimulating interest and enjoyment in learning tasks. So the grading itself is actually a demotivator for actual learning ideas as well. And even providing, encouraging or written notes on graded work does not appear to reduce the negative impact grading exerts on motivation, all right? Grades can dampen existing intrinsic motivation, give rise to extrinsic motivation, enhance fear of failure, reduce interest, decrease enjoyment in classwork, increase anxiety, hamper performance on follow-up tasks, stimulate avoidance of challenging tasks, and heighten competitiveness. I think that's like the opposite of what I want my students to do, right? So there's so many things going on with grades that if you want to motivate students and give feedback, they have to be completely separate from grading in and of itself. And you have to question how you are grading. And if you want to build in grading as feedback and grading as a motivator, there are ways to do it, but it requires a complete revamp of your system. And even, I think a lot of us even will say, like, students who are on the borderline between a C and D, you would think that student would spend more time with studying and getting ready, but in fact, they don't. They just don't. Those borderline grades are in themselves not a motivation for those students to study more and get a passing grade, all right? So this is based upon a paper by Shinsky and Tanner called Teach More by Grading Less or Differently. I strongly recommend all of you read it because it busts into a lot of these issues in higher ed. Some of these are brought up from the Grading for Equity, which if you've read some of it, it's very K-12 oriented. So some of their things are very much like trying to manipulate the political system of K-12. While for us, we can literally be like, I hate this, and just blow it up. So in this case here, generally including a mechanism for feedback without grade assessment can serve to enhance learning and motivation. So if you separate your feedback from grading, that also increases student motivation. Yeah, I have citations at the end of the slides. And I can also email you the article if you want to remind me.
Thank you.
So there's so many things going on here. So I'm not going to go into like norm-based grading because like just like think about this with like the basis idea of that with eugenics and the fact that grading, how many of us do, implies that we're going to compare students and rank students. I don't think your knowledge can be ranked, right? Everyone has different strengths and weaknesses. And so we should really just evaluate you on your content knowledge that we as instructors have subjectively said, I want you to learn this in this course. Thanks, Bridget. So there's so many things going here, and also building in ways to reduce your instructor bias. I'm not saying don't take your professional judgment out of it, just recognize that we all do have biases and things. So this gets into Feldman's 3 pillars of equitable grading, is that it should be accurate. It should accurately represent what the students know in the course, subject to provided learning outcomes, and grading on a rubric. So it should not form anything from formative assessment. It should only be done on what the student knows and provide information about that student knows. Like for instance, if I say you're a B student, that should represent a certain level of content knowledge from said course. Additionally, it needs to be bias resistant, all right? So like, for instance, if you have to bump up a student, many of you are like, hey, I'm gonna go talk to a colleague about this. That reduces bias. That's a bias resistant practice. Keep doing it. But, oh, my screen just got, there we go. My screen just flickered. All right, we're good. So it should be bias resistant. It should reduce your own internal biases against students. So like, for instance, Danny Bernard Martin, in one of his papers, it's also in the end of the slide, says, this is talking about K-12 in the late 90s. Teacher evaluations of student performance were shown to play a greater role, albeit adversely, for Black students than for their peers. For Black students, teacher evaluations was nearly as powerful of a predictor as math performance. So this is talking about math specifically. And when controlling for math performance, teacher evaluation, socioeconomic status, gender, IEP status, and the odds of placement into algebra by 8th grade for Black students was reduced by 2/3 to 2/5 for Black students, controlling for performance. So your grading needs to be bias resistant, because if you're making decisions about bumping students up and not bumping students up, you have to be very aware of your internal biases and about everything else that goes into your grading scheme. So for Black students, high performance does not overcome the impact of a low teacher evaluation rating vis-a-vis 8th grade math placement. So this is K-12 again, but the same things matter here. If you're putting in behavior and biases and things like that, and you're not controlling for your own internal biases, you're going to have issues with those end of the semester grades. And lastly, your grading needs to motivate a growth mindset. You need to be growing as a student. So like, for instance, in that grading system I showed earlier, if you got a 40 on exam 1, your max cap grade drops to an 85%. Why should I keep trying if I was an A student? Why, right? I see that so much in math, where we have A students coming into our programs from other things. They hit our math classes, they get a low grade, and then suddenly they're no longer an A student. So we need to build in a growth mindset in these types of things into our system that includes it. So I'm not saying like don't grade till the end. I'm saying that your grading should correspond to the ability to grow to where you want to be in the course and grow. That's the key thing. So the performance on the exam 1, I would honestly say, hey, maybe the system's not working well with this exam structure, because the earlier exams affect a lot and doesn't encourage a growth mindset. And then lastly, I just gotta call us out. What role does a student play in their own education? Like, for instance, we're having this conversation here with 0 students. There's no students involved. Even the pre-service teachers would probably benefit from these workshops. So I'm just calling us out. Because I just always think about the students, how they are in here. So I was reading this one article lately. I sent you a couple of things where in these conversations about academic development, like curriculum and stuff like that, are we talking about students as objects, consumers or producers, or are they active in it? And most of the time it's either they are the consumers of our knowledge, that's sort of how this is, or they're objects that we're looking at and being like, what's going on with you type of thing. You're acting weird. It's like an experiment being like, that vial shouldn't be yellow. Why is that yellow type of a deal? So we have to call out what role the students have in here, because going back to ideas like bell hooks, being like, we want the students to be liberated in their education. And so in that, we need to bring them into these conversations as well. They have their own opinions on this, and we should probably be hearing them. All right, so in the last 10 minutes, we'll go over strategies for change. I'm not sure we'll get to the last activity, but we can just like open things up a bit. So again, I just want to call it grading is subjective, but your goal is to reduce internal biases, state the objectives clearly with clear grading measures. So the subjective comes about, this is my standard. This is what I want you to do by the end of the course. But that needs to be conveyed clearly to students about everything, and that clearly stated in clear grading measures so that the students understand if they hit those objects or not. So I'm not saying that you should not use your professional judgment. I'm saying use your professional judgment in designing everything. So the core strategies I have here is just literally question everything. I'm like the biggest skeptic about things. Separate feedback from grading that reduces the amount you have to grade. I grade I have my pre-calc class runs a standards-based grading. I grade so little. It takes me maybe an hour a week in grading for that class. It grades so little. Because also if you separate formative work from grading, I don't touch, I just talk about their in-class activities. I don't grade it. We just go over it, talk about it. I was talking about like how my class turned into chaos yesterday. That's because they were getting engaged with the problems. I didn't grade it, but they took that feedback more to heart without that grade. I didn't collect it. I didn't do anything with it. And then this also requires us to reframe homework and other formative work. This should be a time for students to explore and practice their information. It shouldn't be for an assessment. It is for them to understand what they know, self-reflect on things. This is where building in self and peer evaluations to courses will help students learn self-regulation, because they are also in a system where they're used to this, right? So we do also have to account for that as well. If we take away everything, the students won't know what they're doing. In my standards-based grading class, I have to essentially have an advertisement and like PR mechanism for how things are working differently. And even then, students are like, wait, I can do that? And I think we all agree on the curve thing. Assess on demonstrated content knowledge, not behavior. So if anything in there is assessing a behavior of a student, like assigning a 0 for not completing something, a better strategy there would be to reopen that assignment and let them do it. I literally tell my students, I want you to know this by the end of the course, and have a Google form for them to request a homework extension on anything, because I'm like, they might not know it by the next day. They might not be able to do it. They might work nights and need it till the next day. I don't know. I don't care. I just build in these measures so that I'm not affecting the behavior of students. And in this too, building in bias reduction measures as well, like talking to your colleagues, assessing only on content knowledge is a bias reduction measure. And not grading on homework and other formative work is in fact a bias reduction measure, because if they don't do that work and you assign a 0 for them not doing it, that could be biased against our working students, the students who are having issues and are not comfortable or don't even know that they should come talk to you and can ask for those extensions. I had one student tell me that they didn't know that they could come and ask for an extension on a homework because in their syllabus, it says no homework extensions. But they had an exceptional issue where like their parent passed away and that would be an exception, and that's not clearly stated. And going into the course alignment, this is a huge, and I think like we probably like a 3-week-long workshop on just this part alone. The end of semester letter grades alignments need to align with the learning objectives. So those letter grades you give at the end of the class need to be computable from the learning objectives. So that A, B, C, D, and F need to mean something coming from those learning objectives, all right? So like, for instance, some people compute A's as you've mastered like a certain percentage of your learning outcomes, B's are certain percentages. In my class, A's are the exceptional students. They've done above and beyond the learning objectives. And then the B's are the ones that have met all the learning objectives. The C's have met most of the learning objectives, for instance. So building in that sort of structures, now I can go like that A student, I can tell you if I give them a problem, they can do it. That B student, if I give them the problem, they know what they're doing, but they'll probably be making an occasional mistake. That C student, most of those problems are gonna have, like they'll be able to do, but there's occasional weakness in some of them. And then stepping back to the learning outcomes is that you need to do simplified grading using like a 0 to 4 scale. I use a 0 to 3 scale on assessing these, where in each problem is aligned to a learning outcome, I grade it on a 0 to 3. It's a much simpler system because that reduces the amount of variability that I would have in assigning grades. And if they don't meet the expectations, which for me are a 2 or a 3, it's not even a percent. It's like, did you meet it or not? If they don't hit a 2 or a 3, or anyone they can go back and reassess for later. I build in reassessments of knowledge because those letter grades are an end of the course metric. If they meet the standards by the end of the course, that's where I'm happy, right? So building in reassessments of things is super important in this, because it should reflect also sustained knowledge. This is something I didn't really talk about, but if a student has a lot of variation in their grades, that is an issue of something. It indicates something. So you should have in a way where it's a sustained knowledge. For instance, in that example with the grades of going like exam 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or final, for instance, that does not represent sustained knowledge, right? That 95% on the final exam, while we would say, oh yeah, you did great, that represents your knowledge, I still question that because that, like, what if that is an issue? What happens if those are the things that you vary the problems a little bit, that grade drops? It should reflect sustained student knowledge. So the reassessment should allow for boosting of grades and sustained knowledge of things. So whenever you average something, I keep that in mind where the averaging is more of a sustained thing. Let's see here. Yeah, I was telling Denise and Bridget about this. Like, I could probably do like a month-long thing on grading. It's like, this is so much going on in this. So we'll just skip the activity a bit. It's pretty much like redoing it. The earlier one where I give you actually questions about them and have you grade them on a 0 to 4 scale. But at this point, we should all be able to answer those questions, right? And so my question is, should the grade at the end be the average of the activity that we did earlier in this final activity if we had time? Or should it just be based on the final activity? Or should we just have done more activities? Right? I actually don't like exams, so.
So, I mean, I got a ton of questions. I think we need to have a longer discussion on this, honestly, at some point. But, so what you're saying here goes completely against what the university wants.
Yeah.
Right? They want grade in Blackboard, and you're required to do that. That's part of, so that's absolutely against what you just said, which is fine. I'm just saying that's against. My other question is, I mean, my other main question, there's a million of them. How do you apply homework extension? So does any student get a homework extension?
Yeah. They fill out the Google form?
Equality. That's equality. That's not what you're working for.
What do you mean? It's equity.
If everybody gets the same thing, that's equality.
Anyone can use the form. I don't ask why.
That's equality.
It's building in universal design for learning.
That's equality.
Agree to disagree.
That's equality. If everybody gets the same thing, it's equality.
Yeah, it's building in universal design for learning, though. So
I don't care what you're doing. It's equality. Right? If you're applying it to a student that doesn't have anything else equally to the kid that works, has kids, that's fucking equality. And that's not what we're doing.
Well, Rick, I think the one of the things that I've used, because I do like the extension.
I'm not getting mad. I'm just saying, I'm just trying to figure this out because I don't get how you can say, hey, we got homework extensions and we get them to everybody. I don't care what your reason is. That seems to go against what we're trying to do.
Yes.
Well, I think like if I could just say this, because I do use the extension thing. I don't take late work because I think there are a lot of issues with that, and I think that part of it is responsibility and things like that. So I mean, it's something I'll think through. But in terms of equality versus equity, the idea is anyone could request an extension when they want it or need it, right? And so part of that is, even though like there's this idea of like, oh, it's equality, everyone gets one, but the idea is not everyone will take it. The idea is it's available to take it when you need it and if you need it. So if you want to request one, you can request it for whatever you need it for. But, and then you have to, I think through why, and I always have my students, when I tell them, you could always request an extension and I'm going to give it to you for whatever you need it. But you need to have a plan for when you're going to get this in based on your schedule, your life, your work, your other tests. What is your plan for when you're going to submit this, right? And so I think that's where the equity comes in. Some person might just need an extra day because they have a really big exam in another class and that's where their energy goes. Someone else might have had a death in their family and they need a week and a half, right? And so I think like in that way, it is looking at it more from an equitable standpoint of it's different case scenarios, right? And so I think that that's why that kind of works. But I agree that I feel like a bigger discussions and see more examples of how this works, because like I have questions about like the formative work, not grading it, not doing that because it's important. Well, what happens if they just don't do it, especially like in online and hybrid classes? If there's no grade associated and we know formative work is really critical for the final stuff, but they just don't do it because there's no grade associated with it and that's how they've been trained, then what happens, right? And so those are, I have a lot of questions too.
There are a lot
Wonderful.
of ways to go about that. More frequent assessments, will renormalize that. So if you start hitting them more frequently than just like once a month with an exam with assessments, then not having graded homework will more quickly lead to more consequences on those assessments. So if you actually build in reassessments to that, then maybe they'll go back and do the work.
Okay, great. And on that note, we will end as the
I gotta
moderator.
teach you in like 8 minutes, so.
Yes,
I do too.
so as the moderator, I'd like to end. Thank you all for attending this talk. Chris Creighton, you did a wonderful
Yeah,
job
thanks,
to
Chris.
engage the audience, field questions, and move through your material. I'll leave you with a quote. Questions are the engines of intellect, the cerebral machines which convert energy to motion and curiosity to controlled inquiry. Thank you and have a good day.
Thanks, Chris.
Ciao.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah,
Thank
welcome.
you.
I'm always available to just rant about this.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you.